Welcome to part 2 in this series, Preserving Integrity in Turbulent Times. I'm Cinda Rushton, and I am the Bunting Professor of Clinical Ethics in the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics in the School of Nursing. And as we began in part 1 of this series to explore the sources of moral suffering and moral distress that we experience and the kinds of moral adversity that provokes those responses. So today in part 2, we're going to be transitioning into exploring the concept of moral resilience. And so I'm going to invite you to, first of all, reflect on your experience so far, but also to engage with me in exploring this concept of moral resilience. So as we move into this second part, I want to start by acknowledging that moral distress is a real phenomena. It is something that happens to all of us. And I know in my own work, having spent a lot of time focusing on the distress, I began to wonder what else was possible. And I think this quote by His Holiness the Dalai Lama puts it into sharp focus. When we meet real tragedy in life, we can react in one of two ways, either by losing hope and falling into self-destructive habits, or by using the challenge to find our inner strength. And that was really part of the shift for me from focusing on the suffering and the distress, not to overlook it or to discount it in any way, but to say, you know, what else is possible? And so a number of years ago now, I began to try to think about what this concept of moral resilience is and what it might look like. And what I'm going to share with you is very much a work in progress. This is a concept that is evolving. It is one that we are continuing to unpack and understand in a whole variety of ways. But I want to share with you where we are with our thinking as a way to support all of us as we're trying to think about how do we confront moral adversity in a way that is not so detrimental to ourselves or to others. So the definition that we're using now is that moral resilience, a lot of talk about resilience in general, but we're really focusing in on the moral and ethical domain, is the capacity of an individual to sustain or restore integrity in response to some kind of moral adversity. And we talked about that in the first session, the sources of moral adversity that are present in our lives. To illustrate what moral resilience is, I really appreciate this practice that comes from Japan called kintsugi, which is the practice of golden repair. So you could imagine a piece of broken pottery, and often our inclination is, well, that's no longer useful, and we would just throw it away. However, in Japan, instead of doing that, they use this very almost sacred process of actually putting the pieces of the pottery back together in a new way, using the golden paint and cement as a way to not hide the broken parts or the parts that were damaged, but actually to highlight them with the gold paint. And the idea is that by doing this, we're not covering over the distress, the suffering, the broken parts, but rather we are putting them together in a new way that creates perhaps a more beautiful and stronger vessel in the end. And so that's sort of the image I like to think of in terms of moral resilience. I also want to be clear that moral resilience is not about being complacent. It is not about overlooking the kinds of challenges, ethical and moral challenges that we experience in our day-to-day life. It's not about acquiescing and just putting a positive spin on a bad situation or overlooking the ethical challenge, or importantly, it's not about putting all the onus on the individual, but rather to acknowledge that we all experience moral suffering. And is there a path forward that allows us to grow and to integrate those experiences into our lives and into our psyche in a way that is not harmful? So going a little bit further, moral resilience is the capability to discern the boundaries of integrity. And so in doing so, that includes the exercise of conscientious objection or conscientious refusal. So integrity is not about being complacent. Integrity really is the foundation for us to discern what is the appropriate response when our integrity has been challenged or violated in some way. Moral resilience is an invitation to accept things as they are. And this phrase often gets a lot of sort of resistance, because it's like, well, I don't want to accept how things are right now. They're wrong, which is true. Being able to be morally resilient in those circumstances doesn't in any way mean that we're endorsing or overlooking the things that are violating our values or that are fundamentally wrong. But it's sort of like in the moment, accepting that we are in a pandemic, that we have limitations on the kinds of resources that are available right now. Accepting that this pandemic is likely to go on for some time. Accepting the reality instead of fighting it is the beginning of cultivating our sense of moral resilience. It also invites us to acknowledge the boundaries of power and influence. There are many situations where we do not have either the power or the influence to actually bring about the change that we think is necessary. So not to become sort of powerless and hopeless, but to actually acknowledge what is it that I am able to do in this situation based on my personal or professional circumstance. Where are the opportunities for my influence to be effective? And the third thing is to recognize that the evidence of our effective moral agency is reflected both in our conscientious effort and in the outcomes produced. I know in my work in healthcare that a lot of times when clinicians recognize that there's a moral problem that needs attention and they exert effort to try to address it, they feel as if they fail if they don't get the outcome that they had hoped for. I would propose that the effort that they exerted to recognize and to respond and to take action is as important as the outcome. And that if we can find a way to acknowledge our effort as being important in our appraisal of our integrity, it sometimes can support us in recognizing that there are limits to what we are individually able to bring about. So we did some research with healthcare professionals looking at interprofessional definitions of moral resilience. And these are the capacities that were identified in the themes from those definitions: personal and relational integrity, buoyancy, self-regulation and awareness, moral, efficacy and competence, and self-stewardship. So we're going to go through these. We obviously need more research to understand, are these the same ones that people in different circumstances have? But today I'd like to use this as a starting point for us to think about how do we actually cultivate the qualities and the conditions for our integrity to thrive. So I'd like you to just think for a moment about what does moral resilience or integrity, what does integrity mean to you? And how does that show up in your life? What does that mean to you as you think about being a whole person? One of the images that I like a lot is the image of this tree with the deep roots that are into the earth. What does integrity mean to you? So if you would like to just jot down a thought or two about what integrity means to you, just take a moment to do that. Just a word or a phrase. What does integrity mean to you? So there are a lot of definitions of integrity. One is being whole, harmony. But in many ways, when you think about integrity, it starts with me, starts with I. And thinking about integrity, these are some of the ways in which integrity shows up in our life and in our actions. It starts first with knowing what I stand for. And what's important about this is, it's interesting to me in my work with students and with healthcare professionals that some people have a hard time articulating what they stand for. Sometimes they can tell you what they stand against. You know, I stand against racism, but they have a harder time saying what I stand for. Maybe I stand for justice or fairness or equality. So having a clear sense of what you stand for and what your core values are, what your moral compass is, helps to give us guidance in terms of determining what the right action is when our values are compromised in one way or another. So we've got to know what those values are before we can know if they're compromised. We live our values. And this is a nuance. We're really good at talking about our values, but we're not always so good about actually living them, actually being them, having them show up in our work and in our choices and in our conversations. I inquire and am curious to discover what will serve. So this idea of inquiry and being open to learning new information that may in some way adjust or refine how our values are being applied in a situation. This discovering what will serve is about letting go of our own opinion, our own outcome that we can be very attached to. And allowing what needs to happen to actually arise. Integrity requires us to ask hard questions and to speak out for what we stand for, to not be silent and voiceless, but rather to bring our voice in a constructive way into the discussion and into dialogue. A very important part of integrity is I listen to the call of conscience. And it's interesting because conscience is a concept that I suspect for most of us, we have had some relationship with our conscience from the time we were quite young. If you remember back when you were young and your mother told you not to do something and you did it, that twinge in our bodies that we had done something wrong. What's interesting about conscience, and I've learned this through my collaboration with some neuroscientists, is that actually the signals of conscience come in the body before the mind is aware of it. So in our preconscious awareness, what's happening is our amygdala, which is that sort of smoke detector, salience detector, is always looking for threats to either our emotional, physical, or safety. But it also can detect threats to our values. And so what happens often is that those signals begin in the body before we're aware of them in our conscious awareness. Listening to the call of conscience is a very important concept, though, because again, from a neuroscientific point of view, if we habitually override the signals of conscience, it's possible that over time, those signals will not be able to get our attention any longer, that we become more complacent. We normalize things that shouldn't be normalized. We begin to overlook situations where we actually ought to either act or we ought to speak up. And instead of creating norms that actually undermine our values, listening to the call of conscience, and not to use it as the final arbiter, but always to take it seriously and inquire, why is my conscience quivering right now? And how do I understand the significance of that? Integrity requires us to take courageous action, sometimes despite risks, but that doesn't mean that we are meant to be martyrs, but rather that we have a balanced kind of relationship with our courage, that we take principled action, or sometimes the right thing to do is not to act. But regardless of that, we're responsible and accountable for the decisions that we make. So I want you to just take a moment now to really remember and to think about who you are and what you stand for and what really matters most to you. When you think about your life and your work, what are the values that inform your choices, your actions, and the behaviors that you display on a regular basis? Just to have a moment to kind of reflect on what really does matter and what are those values. Can you name them? Can you articulate what those values are that will be your anchor? So the second part of integrity is what we called relational integrity. And what was interesting about this is many clinicians talked about how their personal integrity was intertwined with the integrity of other people. And it's really true when you think about, it's one thing for me to know what I stand for, but in reality, we are always negotiating our values, our choices in relationship. And so in order to be in relational integrity, we have to know who we are. So that sense of personal integrity is actually a prerequisite for being able to be in relational integrity. But one of the important parts of relational integrity is that it acknowledges our shared interdependence, that we have a shared humanity, and that sense of connecting us and creating a kind of solidarity of purpose and presence, and honoring really the contributions of everyone to whatever endeavor we are engaged in. So when I think about healthcare, you know, the relational integrity of every member of the team, everybody, every member of a family, every member of a community or group. Relational integrity really invites us to think about how no one is left out, and how we can honor diversity and be inclusive of all the different contributions and ways of being that are present when we come together as a group. So this idea of relational integrity. Kaz Tanahashi, who is a Japanese calligrapher and translator, helped me to think a little bit differently about the idea of integrity. This is on the front of our book, this Enzo, which Kaz created for me to represent integrity. And what his definition of integrity is whole oneness. And if you think about how interconnected we are, the fact that my integrity and your integrity is fundamentally intertwined, that when my integrity is held up and is consistent, it actually helps others to act with integrity. And the same is also true in the opposite direction. When we are around people who habitually have lapses of integrity, it's more likely that we too will have lapses of integrity. So it's this recognition that our individual integrity comes together in a greater whole. And so this idea of whole oneness is a very interesting concept, I think, to think about, particularly now in the world that we're in. COVID-19 is an example of our interdependence. The virus is not discriminating on any factors that any of us can control. And we are absolutely dependent upon one another to be able to respond to and live through this pandemic. So the third element in moral resilience is buoyancy. And my colleague, Lori Leach, who developed this framework, is a specialist in trauma and helping people to be able to be more resilient. And she talks about this resilient zone, this place where we actually have a little bit of ease, where we can have a stimulus, and that stimulus, you know, we get a little bit of a charge, but we're able to stay in a place of balance and harmony. What happens with a lot of these kinds of situations, and I'm using the example of witnessing or causing harm from COVID-19 as one triggering event, but it could be anything that sort of bumps us out of our resilience zone. And you think about, often those situations are where there's a lot of intensity of emotion. And we're either bumped out of our resilience zone where our nervous system is sort of stuck on hyper arousal, that sense of really being vigilant, hyperactivity. There's a lot of anxiety and sort of panic, irritability, sometimes even rage. And you notice ourselves being a little bit more inflexible. On the other end of the spectrum, we can respond by shutting down. So becoming depressed, disconnected, a sense of fatigue and exhaustion, numbness, the idea that I'm just going through the motions, I really don't feel anything at all. And both of these are examples of being outside of our resilience zone. And what's important about this is most of us have patterns. Sometimes we vacillate between the two. Sometimes we're in the hyper arousal state, and other times we're not. But it's important for us to know what those patterns are and to be able to detect how the signals of being out of our resilience zone show up. Because what happens is we often then, in response to that, can feel shame or guilt, and a whole variety of compensatory mechanisms, often not helpful ones, like avoidance, can lead to things like burnout and PTSD, which I believe we're going to see an awful lot of as we move through this pandemic. So the idea of buoyancy is that we want to keep ourselves in a balance. And one of the ways to do that is the next element, which has to do with self-regulation and self-awareness. And this phrase by Viktor Frankl I love, because it talks about between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. And so part of the idea here is that we want to recognize those patterns so that we can be more buoyant. But we often will need some additional skills and tools. And one of those skills and tools is actually developing the neural pathways that support us so that when we are bumped out of our resilience zone, we have some tools and skills and resources to support us, to help us get back into balance. So one of those is mindfulness, the ability to actually focus in on what's happening right now without judgment, and to be able to do that in a kind way toward our own limitations. But mindfulness is not something that requires any particular belief. It's actually a set of skills that helps us pay attention, to focus our attention in a particular way. to be able to focus on, for example, our breath, gives our mind a chance to relax just for a moment. So if you wouldn't mind to just take a moment now and just let yourself relax wherever you are. Just let yourself sink into the chair wherever you're sitting, and just notice how you are right now in this moment, not sort of interpreting, but just noticing. Maybe you notice what it feels like, for example, to have your back touching the back of the chair or your feet on the floor. Just focusing your attention on a particular space in your body, whether it's your back or your feet, whatever feels comfortable for you. But just taking a moment to actually focus your attention. Just letting your breath be easy. Noticing the inhale and the exhale. And letting your shoulders drop. Noticing if there's any tension in your jaw or in your neck. And just for a moment, feeling the experience of your lungs expanding on the inhale. And as you exhale, and as you do that, to just be with whatever's come up and notice how you're feeling as you allow yourself to just relax a little bit more, just for a moment or two. And when you're ready, just if you close your eyes or not, just allow your eyes to open and just kind of take stock of how you are. You might be wondering why self-regulation and this kind of focused attention is important in the context of moral suffering. But one of the really important reasons that we need to be able to calm our nervous system is so that we can perceive things clearly, so that we can actually make decisions from a place of stability rather than reactivity, and to respond rather than to react. And so developing these skills in self-regulation are absolutely essential for us to be morally resilient, to act in accordance with our values, and to preserve our sense of integrity. The next piece is what we call moral efficacy, possessing the skills, the knowledge, the qualifications to recognize when moral problems exist, and to be able to discern what is the appropriate response using a whole variety of skills and tools, so that we can exercise our moral agency in ways that reflect our integrity and our values. And these capacities include actually embodying our values, but being able to perceive clearly what the ethical contours are of a situation, to discern what is the appropriate response and what would be in alignment with our values, and then to move from that to action that also is in alignment with our values and our integrity. And the last one is what we call self-stewardship. And this is a concept that many of you will be familiar with, and one that most of us as human beings put low on our priority list. But self-stewardship is about embodying a commitment to really know ourselves, and to do that in a way that acknowledges what our limitations are, to responsibly and mindfully manage our own personal resources in a way that doesn't overwhelm or deplete us. And in the midst of this COVID virus, it's really, really important that we know what those boundaries are, because some of us are really stuck on this, sort of hyper arousal. And also to recognize and with compassion to respond to our limitations. We are all human beings, and as a result of that, we do have limits. And expecting ourselves to go beyond what is humanly possible will only result in exhaustion and depletion, and is absolutely not a sustainable way of being. So self-stewardship really involves choosing actions that are wholesome and healthy. So those are the elements of moral resilience. And what I'd like to invite you to do is to spend some time reflecting on how those elements show up for you and how you might be able to use them in your own life and work, and to be able to think about how you might be able to intensify some of those elements for yourself. And we'll talk some more about that in the third segment of this particular series. But I want to leave you with this quote from one of my nursing colleagues, Jen Simmons, because I think it actually reflects an important insight. We are all resilient and courageous. Sometimes we need tools and support to help us access what's already inside of us. And I think that's true about moral resilience as well. You know, we come into the world in a place of integrity, and we are whole as we begin our journey in life. And sometimes, you know, as Rachel Remen often says, wholeness is never lost, it's just forgotten. And so I would invite you to explore and to remember what it feels like to be whole and to be in alignment with your values, and see what you can discover as we journey together. Thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to our next discussion.